Welcome to Science in Your Shopping Cart, a new series that shows how science touches many of the products you buy at the grocery store, from new varieties of fruits and vegetables to technological advances that make your food safer, cheaper, and tastier. I'm Todd Silver. Aquaculture, commonly known as fish farming, is a global multi-billion-dollar industry and is one of the fastest growing forms of food production. In fact, according to NOAA, more than half of the world's seafood comes from aquaculture. Unfortunately, and this may come as a surprise to many, I know I was surprised to learn that most of the farmed fish we buy and consume actually comes from other countries.
Here in the U.S., we are not a major producer of aquaculture products, and so we see an opportunity to increase aquaculture production, to be able to provide more of the seafood that consumers value, and to be able to reduce some of the burden on those international fisheries.
I visited with Dr. Caird Rexroad, ARS's national program leader on aquaculture. Dr. Rexroad sees tremendous potential in aquaculture growth in this country, and ARS will play a huge role in the future of fish farming, especially finfish, shellfish, and aquatic plants.
We've been able to partner with many of our stakeholders to develop genetic improved stock and transfer those to the industry. We've been able to develop animal health solutions, vaccines, and other things that we've been able to provide as well. I think this will continue into the future, as we develop not only the genetically improved stocks, but the strategies for developing improved stock, more animal health solutions as we move away from the use of antibiotics and look for alternatives that ensure aquatic animal health. These are the things that will continue to be important.
There are many benefits to aquaculture for the agricultural industry, the environment, and for consumers. To name a few, it gives us greater access to seafood, which are rich in omega-3 fatty acids and help promote greater health, including possibly reducing the risk of Alzheimer's and rheumatoid arthritis, and aid in the development of muscle tissues. Fish farming also reduces the burden on our waterways to keep up with growing consumer demand for seafood. It creates a sustainable method for long-term access to seafood, while giving our precious waterways more time to restock itself naturally.
Aquaculture is part of the solution for overfishing on the global scale. We see that aquaculture can be part of the solution for climate change and adapting to climate change, right? And so the ability to have local products that consumers value that don't have to be shipped from across the world is something that we think is important.
The benefits to aquaculture are bountiful, but unfortunately, so are the challenges. Here in this podcast, you'll learn about the different ways that finfish like catfish, trout, and salmon, as well as oysters and other shellfish, are farmed. Some are raised in indoor circulatory systems, while others are grown in huge nets in our oceans, while still others are grown in aquifers.
These are all industries that have their own unique issues that they have to deal with. Some of the things that would be in common is, feed and feed ingredients. How are we going to feed aquaculture, and especially if we expand production in the U.S., combating some of the diseases that we have on farms, making sure that we're maintaining the water quality that we need, both in terms of the water that comes into our systems, using our water and make sure that we're maintaining our animal well-being and welfare. And then also what we return to the environment. Are we capturing our waste? Do we have a waste stream that's a useful product in itself? And we're making sure that we're responsible stewards of our environment.
Another big challenge is getting consumers to be more conscious about buying seafood that's farm-raised right here in the U.S., sometimes in your own backyard. Did you know that salmon is being raised right now in Florida? Or rainbow trout in Idaho are being fed plant-based diets? Or that oysters are being grown on both coasts? Did you know that steelhead is part of the trout family and it can be grown in indoor facilities?
We need to win over the consumer in terms of farm fish being a good product. We need to make sure we do a good job. We need to make science-based decisions in terms of our policy and the growth, and if we do that, I think it'll happen.
ARS researchers are working closely with fish farmers to produce popular finfish and shellfish that are tastier, have consistent market weight and color, and are resistant to common diseases. Looking to the future, I asked Dr. Rexroad about the next generation of fish to be farmed.
This is a really important question. Right now the federal government is looking at how we can expand aquaculture production, and especially in marine waters. Across the board, many agencies are looking at marine finfish in particular and what is the next big fish that we should invest in terms of research. We have come up with a list of candidate species that we think are promising, but we're trying to complement the intersection of our technical feasibility and ability to culture these species with interest in the market. Is there a market for this fish? Is there a price point that makes it have real potential for an aquaculture species in the U.S.?
Two promising candidates are Florida Pampano, which is a fast-growing and tasty fish similar to mahi-mahi, and red drum, a popular gaming fish that's sweet and mild in flavor, similar to red snapper.
We have several stakeholder groups that are growing pompano and recirculating aquaculture systems, and so we see great potential there. Red drum is another species that we're very much interested in. We have a stakeholder base, and we're beginning to engage those folks and look at the potential for growth here in the U.S.
In this seafood edition of Science in Your Shopping Cart, we're going to learn how research facilities across the country are developing new fish farming techniques, new strains of fish, are keeping fish healthy, and creating more sustainable methods for raising finfish and shellfish. So get your lemon and seasonings ready, because in today's episode, we're taking a deep dive into seafood. We start our seafood expedition in the Pacific Northwest, specifically the Snake River Plain Aquifer in southern Idaho. This is where about 75% of all commercial rainbow trout is produced in the U.S.
This is a really unique area. I mean, that's the reason we raise 75% of the rainbow trout here, is because we have the Snake River Aquifer, which provides pristine water that's basically the best water you can get at the right temperature, constant temperature, 14 degrees C, for rearing rainbow trout. So they grow incredibly fast here.
That's Dr. Ken Overturf, research geneticist with ARS's Small Grains and Potato Germplasm Research Unit in Aberdeen, Idaho. Yes, this is Idaho, so potato research is big here. But so is fish farming, especially using flow-through systems where the fish are raised in a natural but contained environment. The aquifer provides the water under the perfect conditions to grow fish incredibly fast.
This water does not change. It's the same year-round, and the fish grow much faster than they do in other rearing environments.
It's interesting that when you think of a contained or farm system, you think of large tanks or long channels. But this system is actually in the open, using a natural river down from a canyon, and yet they could still control the most important elements for raising fish: water quality, flow, density, temperature, and feed.
It is pretty amazing. It flows right out of these canyon walls. So basically, it really can't be captured for anything else because you have a short fall from that canyon to the river. You're not going to use it for anything else. And it's evolved where they've built these raceways to raise trout between where the canyon is and where the river to capture that as it flows down. Yeah, it's a unique and amazing system here.
The biggest challenge here, and with other aquifer flow-through systems, is the inability to expand the size of the facility. I mean, you can't just widen the canyon or expand the river. It is what it is. So without the ability to expand, Dr. Overturf and his colleagues focus on best management practices to increase fish yields, health, and size. The main priorities are diet and rainbow trout strain. Most rainbow trout diets here are comprised of fish meal, soybean meal, poultry byproducts, and fish oil to a less extent. Dr. Overturf is working with farmers to scale up plant-based feeds, such as soybean.
They are really good about that because they make a real push for sustainable, and they show that their product is sustainably farmed, that they're producing more soybean meal with less carbon footprint, less water, less soil erosion, and they can market that product. So we can put that in the feed and say that these fish are reared on sustainable products.
Dr. Overturf also helps run a feed lab, which can produce relatively large batches of commercial quality feed for testing. They're even testing insect meal, which has become a popular feed product because of its high protein content and availability. I mean, whoever said we don't have enough insects?
We look at everything. We buy products from a number of other different supply streams. I mean, it's always scale is what it comes down to. There's a lot of great products out there, but having it to scale, and it has to be readily available to the feed processors. I mean, that's a huge thing. If they can't get it reliably sourced and the same consistency, they're not going to use it.
Dr. Overturf works closely with fish farmers on selecting quality plant-based food for their particular breeds of fish. He also said holding the fish at the proper density could help increase production, along with completely understanding the water environment, including water quality and chemistry, microbiome levels, and effluent discharge. Combining these management practices can substantially increase healthy yields and size while maintaining consistent taste.
This is something our group focuses on, production. We work really closely with producers. We're constantly speaking with them, and we have research projects. I've got germplasm that's being released to the industry constantly. It's utilized by the majority of the industry. Working with these groups now, I mean, they're looking at improving production 25% here in the next couple of years, just on the existing facilities. Again, management practices and putting all those interactions together and understanding how they interact is huge.
That increase is important to keep up with consumer demand for healthy, tasty fish that's sold at a price point that allows the average American family to eat seafood multiple times a week. The current market is pretty split between farm-raised and wild, but we still import billions of pounds of fish every year. Certainly there's room to grow our aquaculture industry.
I see consumer demand going up for fish. Aquaculture is getting more and more of the market. There's more fish being reared than beef and pork. It's continually growing, and as the demand for aquaculture or seafood grows, that sustainability market is going to go up too.
We're heading to the East Coast, making our way to Leetown, West Virginia, to check out how ARS scientists are using indoor recirculating systems to improve the health and yields of rainbow trout. We met with Dr. Beth Cleveland, research physiologist at ARS's National Center for Cool and Cold Water Aquaculture Lab. As you may expect, this is a much different system than the aquifer we talked about earlier, or the net pen method, where farm-raised fish are actually grown in large netted pens in natural waterways, such as oceans and rivers.
One of the challenges with growing them in open net pens is you do have this infinite amount of water, but then you're exposing the fish to so many more environmental pathogens, so that comes with its own set of challenges. And that's something that the recirculating system industry can really control because everything is inside, and so there really is no exposure to external water that hasn't been treated.
The lab where Dr. Cleveland conducts her research has tanks of all sizes and uses for each stage of a trout's life, from eggs to juveniles to adults. The variety of tanks enables Dr. Cleveland and her colleagues to conduct studies on fish at different sizes, from hatch to harvest, and they can also research how different water temperatures, flow, and feeds affect fish yield, size, and health, including stress.
We are about ready to start a study looking at how the disease-resistant fish respond to hypoxia stress. So low oxygen is one of the problems that the industry faces, especially when you're moving fish through a raceway and there are multiple levels of raceway. The lower levels tend to have lower levels of oxygen. Also, when fish are being produced in recirculation systems, oxygen has to be added to that water to maintain the optimal living conditions. And so our question is, do husbandry strategies need to change because we've selected for disease resistance or selected for fillet yield? So that's something that we're looking with a hypoxia stress challenge.
At the time of our visit here in Leetown, there were approximately 10,000 fish in different stages of life in this facility. But in the springtime, when eggs typically hatch, the facility can house over 100,000 eggs. The eggs are placed in hatching jars, where researchers can slow down or speed up development by controlling the water temperature. From there, they move into small but deep containers, where researchers can study traits of interest, such as fillet yield, disease resistance, and reproductive success, and investigate how genomic markers can be predictive for these traits. Once they reach a certain age and weight close to adulthood, they're placed in large pools and evaluated for size, weight, color, and growth rate. Currently, Dr. Cleveland's research is focusing on fillet yield.
We chose to select for fillet yield because it's a trait that the farmers are interested in. They want a high yield fish. The other benefit for us selecting for fillet yield is that we can use this population to develop selection markers. And the selection markers give us information about the DNA of the fish so that we can tell whether or not a fish will be good for breeding for fillet yield solely based on looking at its DNA. So then we can do individual-based selection rather than family-based selection.
One of the most interesting studies here is with the development of albino rainbow trout. This was a proof of concept project in order to see if they could use gene editing both as a research tool to understand the biology of the fish and to enhance its traits.
In this case, we focus on the genes that cause pigmentation because it's a very, very quick trait that we can identify upon hatch to determine whether or not the gene editing works. So as soon as these fish were hatched, we could say, yes, the gene editing worked. We can use this to target other traits or other genes that affect production traits.
The research here has resulted in a 2.7% increase in fillet yield over 3 generations. That's an impressive number when you're talking about a fish farm that produces 15 million pounds of fish each year. More yield means more revenue for the aquaculture industry, while at the same time maintaining the texture, color, and lipid content that consumers are looking for. Dr. Cleveland points out that rainbow trout provides just as much healthy fats as salmon, and steelhead, which is a variety of rainbow trout, has similar firmness, color, and taste compared to the highly popular Atlantic salmon.
The biggest challenge is getting consumers to recognize that trout are just as delicious as salmon. Trout are delicious to eat. They have a very high omega-3 content, so they are heart healthy. From a research standpoint, it's an excellent model for Atlantic salmon, which is one of the most popular food fish, but it can be more difficult to raise in-house. And trout and salmon are very highly related, so what we learn in trout can oftentimes relate to salmon. And so not only is it an excellent food fish, we can produce it very well in this country. It's fun to fish for, so we can stock the fish and use that as a recreational tool. And then it's also a model for other species.
By now, you've heard the common theme regarding what aquaculture growers are looking for from ARS researchers, mainly faster growing fish and bigger yields. And time and again, ARS has met the challenge. In fact, here at the National Coldwater Marine Aquaculture Center in Orono, Maine, researchers like Dr. Brian Peterson have doubled the weight of Atlantic salmon at market. Fish farmers rely on ARS to help resolve serious issues they face, from production to management practices. Recently, the industry asked researchers here to embark on their biggest challenge yet.
What they'd like is improved germplasm that they can add to their already selected Atlantic salmon. Right now, sea lice is a big issue for them. And so, if there's anything that we can do on the selective breeding side of things to improve the sea lice resistance, they would be all for that. Faster growing fish and one that doesn't get attacked by sea lice, that would help them out tremendously. I'm really excited that for the first time ever, we're going to be trying to select for something other than just carcass weight.
Sea lice are nasty critters that attach to fish and feed on their skin and blood. Not only do they cause physical harm, but they can also stress the fish out, which can then affect their growth rate and ability to fight off other diseases. I mean, how would you like a bloodsucker attached to your skin all the time? There currently are no vaccines or effective treatments for sea lice. If Dr. Peterson and his colleagues were to develop Atlantic salmon that were resistant to sea lice, it would be a game changer for the industry. But this type of research won't be easy.
For disease resistance, it's very difficult for a number of reasons. One, with disease resistance, it's usually a lowly heritable trait. So you make less genetic gain by trying to select for really any disease. And so it's going to take you longer to achieve that goal. The second is you have to disease challenge all of the families that you have, and we typically have between 125 and 135 families of fish that we maintain. So you're going to have to take a subset of those each year and disease challenge them all.
For the disease challenge, researchers utilized their fish families as well as sea lice collected from net pens. The sea lice are closely monitored as they grow to a particular stage, and then the families of fish are infected. After about 2 weeks, the fish are euthanized and examined to see how many sea lice are on their skin.
That is a huge effort. There's lots of manpower that gets devoted into counting sea lice under a microscope. So there's all that effort, and then you have to take that data and then incorporate that into a selective breeding program. So yeah, it's a big challenge, no pun intended.
Once researchers identify fish that are either highly susceptible to or have shown resistance to sea lice, they next have to answer the big question.
We'd like to know why. What is it that makes a family resistant or susceptible to a disease? We've recently hired an immunologist, and they're going to be looking into trying to answer some of those questions. But yeah, if you identify a family or families of fish that's resistant, you better replicate that out in the real world to see if in fact it's just something that you only see in a tank, or can we replicate this out in a sea cage or net pen? And to be honest with you, we're not there yet. But that's ultimately, that will need to be investigated and demonstrated.
Once a family of fish have demonstrated good resistance to sea lice, Dr. Peterson will collaborate with researchers at the Cool and Cold Water Aquaculture Research Center in Leetown to research the genome of the family, possibly paving the way for breeding a new line of Atlantic salmon that could shed the nasty sea lice disease.
We've been very fortunate. We've been able to collaborate with those scientists down there to help us move the genomic part of our data in helping us towards improving our selective breeding program. If it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be doing it.
Developing a new breed of Atlantic salmon with resistance to sea lice will take time, but this facility has a proven record of success with developing improved strains, including the St. John strain, a North American Atlantic salmon.
The reason why this facility started was because they wanted to have a North American strain for here in the United States. You could get European strains imported, but the industry really wanted something that was of North American origin.
The St. John's Atlantic salmon is a highly sought-after fish, and its popularity is helping the U.S. aquaculture industry gain a bigger market share for farm-raised seafood, something Dr. Peterson hopes will continue in the future.
Aquaculture in general, we have a big deficit in what we produce, and so we have to import most of the aquaculture products from other places around the world to meet the demand. There's a huge demand for Atlantic salmon right now here in the United States. So we definitely have room to grow both on the Atlantic salmon side as well as other aquaculture products.
We're making our way up and down the East Coast here, at least in part virtually. Let's head back down to Shepherdstown, West Virginia. Here we're speaking with Brian Vinci, an aquacultural engineer at the Conservation Fund Freshwater Institute. Dr. Vinci helps fish farmers design, build, and maintain indoor recirculation systems for raising salmon and trout. His research includes developing highly efficient water treatment systems, where large tanks that hold growing fish are initially filled with fresh water, and then a complex system filters and recirculates the water, which significantly reduces the need to replenish the tanks with fresh water.
With climate change, we're seeing constraints on all sorts of resources, including water. So the idea with this program is to use water carefully. Now, aquaculture in general is not a consumptive user of water. We use it, we put it out. But with recirculation aquaculture in the program here, the idea is to reduce that to the minimum possible, to be careful about it, and then capture as much waste as possible into that flow so you can treat it and remove it. And actually be able to site these fish farms close to population centers to get people fresh, high-quality seafood close to them for a lower carbon footprint.
Dr. Vinci notes that in his facility, they typically have to provide enough fresh water to replace the existing water in this large fish tank every 10 days. But with newer technologies, including membrane biological reactors, which we'll hear about later, they could stretch it to 50 or 100 days.
That's 1/100th of that water use that we are currently at. And that would be a tremendous goal or achievement for us.
Okay, let's take a tour of this indoor recirculation system. This whole building is modeled after a 1 to 10 scale fish farm. This is so the research done here can be applied directly to fish farms at scale. We start in a sort of nursery section, which looks like racks of narrow drawers. These temperature-controlled drawers are where eggs are brought in and hatched for research projects. Aquaculture farms are always asking ARS researchers to study things like fish yield, size, taste, color, and disease resistance. They start by evaluating the eggs, and once they hatch and start to grow, they're moved into these small but deep tanks where researchers study things that may affect their growth, including stressors. These tanks are constantly monitored for dissolved oxygen, carbon dioxide, and total gas pressure. Hanging over the tanks are these black plastic tarps, which allows researchers to study how different light periods can affect fish health and growth. We now move to the big tank, 40,000 gallons, where researchers can see how different conditions affect growth as fish reach harvest size. This tank is also equipped with cameras to visually inspect the health of the fish. For example, if a lesion is spotted on the head of a fish, it may alert the fish farmer of a possible disease outbreak, and they can then hopefully get ahead of the disease outbreak before it affects all the fish in the tank.
What you'll see is there's no water leaving the system today. This is essentially zero exchange system right now. To have such little water use, we have to have technologies to treat the water, to remove the waste and add back oxygen.
The tank is equipped with 2 drains, one on the bottom of the tank and the other on the side, which acts like a pool skimmer. This drain captures 95% of the flow and moves the water through a microscreen filter. This microscreen filter has a barrel with screen panels inside, and the panel openings are only about 90 microns.
All of the solids that the fish excrete or waste feed is caught on the inside of the filter, and only the water that passes through the openings, the 90 micron openings, comes out. So this controls the solids and takes them out of the system quickly. It actually creates the waste stream that a lot of our research in the next 5 years is going to look at, anaerobic digesting it or composting it.
After filtration, the water moves to a sump where the water is pumped to be treated through a biofilter and degassed. Now, these biofilters are essential to maintaining water quality for the fish. Researchers here are using a series of 6-inch wide mini biofilters to treat the water from the fish tank for an experiment with different therapeutics to test biofilter function. Now let's move on to the big boy. Here is the biofilter, a beast standing over 30 feet tall and over 9 feet in diameter. After the solids are removed and the water is pumped, the water moves to this full-size biofilter, which processes about 1,200 gallons of water a minute.
And that's the amount of flow that you have to remove the ammonia to keep it low enough for the fish. The biofilter itself has sand inside, and the bacteria that convert ammonia to non-toxic nitrogen live on the sand or attached to it.
Once the water flows out of the top, it's aerated to remove carbon dioxide. Oxygen is then added, and it flows back into the fish tank. Dr. Vinci likens the recirculation system to a greenhouse for fish.
We're using the ability to treat the water inside a structure to create the controlled environment. We can keep the conditions for the fish, optimal oxygen, optimal ammonia, optimal carbon dioxide, hopefully optimal everything to allow the fish to have good health and welfare, because that's a primary thing for us. But then to do it in an efficient way, really anywhere. Similar to a greenhouse where you control the environment and can grow tomatoes in Maine or Canada, you can grow Atlantic salmon, a cold water fish, in Florida. Now they have to chill their water because they're in Florida, but they're able to do that because of the technologies that have been developed with ARS support here.
In addition to developing recirculating systems, researchers here are testing different strains of fish that could be optimal to grow in these indoor systems.
And that's important because we're seeing a boom in construction of these facilities, and the genetic strains that those farms are using are really strains from other types of aquaculture, flow-through or net pen salmon culture. We're working with ARS scientists both in Maine and here in West Virginia to improve strains for performance in the recirculation systems.
We've been talking a lot about growing fish with bigger yields and consistent size and flavor, but what about their waste? Now, you may think waste from a single fish isn't a big deal, but when you're raising tens of thousands of fish that weigh 4 to 5 pounds or more, well, that's a ton of waste, maybe several tons. A byproduct, so to speak, of Dr. Vinci's work is turning that waste into a valuable product for fish farmers, such as biogas.
So in other terrestrial agriculture like dairy, they will collect all of the manure, they will digest that manure to create methane, and then use that methane to power the electricity used on the farm. And so we're looking to use that kind of technology here for contained fish farms because we capture all the waste. It's easy for us to do that, and the idea is to do something with it.
This secondary revenue stream only adds to the benefit of building a recirculating fish farm. However, Dr. Vinci sees the primary benefit being able to provide consumers with a variety of local, fresh fish. We're talking fresh salmon in Florida, fresh sea bass in Connecticut, and how about fresh steelhead in New York City?
I think making fish more common, increasing production overall for the consumer will help Americans get to that 1 to 2 seafood meals a week for the public health benefits. Because right now, Americans lag globally in seafood consumption. But if we can bring it more to the U.S. and it's American grown, I think we'll actually lift the boat for all of us.
One of the biggest challenges to the aquaculture industry is preventing and mitigating disease. A single disease can knock out an entire season's worth of fish in just a matter of days, placing a tremendous strain on fish farmers and deeply affecting the seafood market. ARS researchers are being asked more and more to help with fighting fish diseases. We've made our way back to the Cool and Cold Water Research Center in Leetown, where molecular biologist Dr. Greg Wiens and his colleagues are fighting fish disease 3 ways. First, they're developing vaccines. Second, they're breeding fish strains that are resistant to select diseases. And third, they're providing guidance to the industry of best practices for keeping their fish healthy.
We had toured a bunch of fish farms and talked to producers and talked to them about their problems. And what we found is that every location has kind of a unique set of problems and oftentimes require kind of different approaches. Probably the easiest approach is to develop a vaccine against the pathogen, but there are a number of pathogens that the vaccine approach hasn't worked, and so we've tried a different approach for those, and that's trying to improve the genetic resistance of the fish against the pathogen.
Selective fish breeding programs for disease resistance has become an increasingly important role in aquaculture production. As Dr. Wiens mentioned, some diseases just don't respond well to vaccines.
We puzzled over that. Why do some vaccines work and why do some vaccines fail? If you look at the history of immunology, this has been the phenomena that has been observed since the beginning. We're still struggling to make a vaccine, for example, against HIV or tuberculosis and malaria. Those have been historically very challenging diseases, and the same equivalent is true in the fish world. There are some diseases that the first time people have tried to make a vaccine just by killing the bacteria and introducing it to the fish, it works great. And they've been vaccines that have worked for 50 years now in aquaculture. Now you try the exact same thing with other pathogens and it doesn't work. It has to do with the details of the immune system, what the immune system responds to, and when it responds, is it responding in the right way? Is the response protective? So the vaccines that have worked really well against some of the bacterial pathogens, there's an antibody response, and those antibodies at very low concentrations kill the bacteria, and it's very effective. Now, for these other pathogens, like the bacterial cold water disease, antibodies don't work very well for reasons we still don't understand. And I think that you need more of a cell-mediated immune response, and that's what I think we've changed with our breeding.
Bacterial cold water disease is one of the most frequent causes of elevated mortality in juvenile salmonids, such as salmon, trout, and steelhead.
It's really a kind of a terrible disease. It's kind of the equivalent of the leprosy in the fish world. So it's a disease that the producers don't like, and they really want better solutions. Historically, antibiotics have been used, and their interest in reducing antibiotic use against this problem. And so we decided to take a breeding approach.
The problem with breeding new lines of fish is it's a slow process involving multiple generations and many years. That's why researchers will first try to develop a vaccine for a disease. A vaccine can be developed, tested, and ready within a couple years, while breeding a new strain could take 5 years or more.
But that said, one of the advantages of the breeding approach is once you have a resistant fish, all the farmer has to do is to raise the eggs in the fish. He or she doesn't have to do anything else. And so the farmers really love having a resistant animal.
For years, Dr. Wiens and his colleagues have been working on strains that are resistant to cold water disease. And after 5 generations of breeding, they have improved fish survival by 60 percentage points.
That had a meaningful difference on the farm and survival. So my research is really trying to understand what we've changed in these fish, how we've changed the immune system. Are there any trade-offs that we've made by making the fish more resistant? What happens when you vaccinate the fish that are more resistant? These are the things that I'm still continuing to work on. And really, we're trying to get to the bottom of the actual genes that we've selected variants for that confer greater resistance in our fish.
The third prong to fighting fish diseases is working closely with the farmers and offering best practices to keeping their fish healthy.
We really rely on the input of the farmers to tell us what their top problems are, and we try to help get to the bottom of what the issue is. They have a good sense of a happy fish versus a not happy fish. They look at their fish every day and they know when there's an issue. They don't always know exactly what the cause of the problem is, though, and the cause and effect can be difficult to sort out. What's the cause and what's then the best course of action? That's where I think we can, again, add value and help with that decision process.
Time to test your acumen for aquaculture, courtesy of the National Agricultural Statistics Service 2018 census. Which state had the top aquaculture sales in 2018? Was it Mississippi, Maryland, California, or Louisiana? The answer, Mississippi at 216 million. In 2018, which farmed fish accounted for the most sales? Was it salmon, trout, sea bass, or catfish? The answer? Catfish at 366 million. In that time frame, which farm-raised mollusk generated the most sales? Was it clams, oysters, shrimp, or crabs? The answer? Oysters at 284 million. True or false? Some farms raise alligators mainly for their meat. The answer? That's false. They're raised on farms, but mainly for their hides. True or false? Fish farmers use ponds more than any other method of production. That's true. Nearly 1,200 farms use ponds. How many pounds of live weight fish were raised in the U.S. in 2018? Was it 120 million pounds, 250 million pounds, 460 million pounds, or 60.23 billion pounds? The answer? 460 million pounds. Which seafood is the fastest growing in aquaculture? Is it salmon, oysters, steelhead, or mollusks? Would you believe it's mollusks? True or false? There are more fish farms raising ornamental fish than sport fish. That's false. Aside from your traditional fish farms, there are over 500 fish farms that either raise ornamental fish, such as koi, or sporting fish, such as largemouth bass. That's enough fish trivia for one day. Let's get back to the show. When we think of aquaculture, or fish farming, what comes to mind? Salmon, trout, catfish. How about oysters? Probably not so much, but oysters and other shellfish play a large role in aquaculture.
Oh, I think shellfish is a huge component of aquaculture, and it's really the wave of the future. There are so many things about shellfish aquaculture that make it very sustainable and low environmental impact.
That's Dina Porestu, research geneticist at ARS's National Coldwater Marine Aquaculture Center in Orono, Maine. Aside from the culinary aspect of shellfish, which is a multi-billion-dollar industry, shellfish are an essential part of our ecosystem.
Shellfish are filter feeders. They get all of their food from the water column, and they can filter the entire Narragansett Bay, which is where I'm located, in a day and a half. I mean, they're really good at cleaning the water. And so they're really good for water quality. The more shellfish you have out, the better the water quality in the surrounding area is going to be. They're also pretty easy to grow, like low maintenance, but with a positive environmental footprint rather than a negative one.
Unfortunately, many shellfish, such as oysters, have been overharvested for decades. From a consumer standpoint, this could mean higher prices at the market or restaurant, but there's a bigger environmental impact. As Dr. Porestu mentioned, oysters act as hard-working filters for our oceans and rivers, absorbing toxins and other bad nutrients that could choke oxygen out of our waterways. If the oyster population decreases, our precious waterways become polluted and lack oxygen. Increasing the oyster population is a primary goal at the National Coldwater Marine Aquaculture Center. Researchers like Dr. Porestu raise healthy oysters from little babies until they can be set out in their natural environment.
We bring adult oysters in and we condition those oysters, get them ready to reproduce, and then we allow them to reproduce indoors. Oysters have a complex life cycle where they float around in the water for about 3 to 4 weeks. And then when they're ready, when they're competent to settle, they'll settle down, and they like to settle and attach to hard substrates. Sometimes they attach to one another or to dead shell or to rocky surfaces. And that's how you create oyster reefs. So we keep them in the lab during that whole time. And then when we know they're ready to settle, we add small little pieces of sand or finely ground shell and allow the larvae to settle on that. And that's how we get single oysters.
At this point, the baby oysters are placed in containers and immersed in nutrient-rich water, which allows them to grow fast. Once they reach about 5 or 10 millimeters, they're secured in bags and placed along the coastline, estuaries, and similar waterways. This particular oyster species is native to the East Coast, and therefore can be raised all along the eastern seaboard, from Canada to the Florida Peninsula. Two main challenges to increasing the oyster population are disease and climate change.
They kind of go hand in hand. As the climate is warming, a lot of diseases, specifically parasitic diseases, and even bacterial diseases, their range is expanding. And that means that the prevalence of the disease and how it affects the oysters or where it affects the oysters is also expanding. And then, just the impact of climate change on growth and shell strength. Now we don't know what the impact is, but we worry about it because the warming temperature in the oceans is affecting calcification rates. That's a big deal because oyster shells are, made of calcium carbonate. So the deposition rates for shell change. And theoretically, we would get oysters with weaker shell, and that would just make them prone to predation and other things that could harm them.
These growing environmental factors place an even greater importance on Dr. Porestu's research, which aims to produce more seeds that grow quicker and are resistant to common diseases. This often comes down to studying genetics, and Dr. Porestu and her colleagues were the first to map the genome of the eastern oyster, which includes hundreds of thousands of genetic markers. This research will be shared with ARS breeding programs to breed the next generation of oysters.
These are all things that we've been doing, and I'm really excited because I think in the next year or two, we're going to have those associations between genes and phenotypes that will really help move the oyster industry, especially for breeding for disease resistant, in the right direction.
Moving virtually to the West Coast, we're here at the Forage, Seed, and Cereal Research Center in Corvallis, Oregon. Not the place you'd expect to see oyster research, but here research geneticist Dr. Neil Thompson works closely with the Oregon State University breeding program to breed new strains of the Pacific oyster. You may not know it, but oysters grown here on the West Coast are much different than the ones we learned about earlier from the East Coast.
One of the biggest challenges that we have on the Pacific coast is how cold our water is compared to the Atlantic. Funnily enough, oysters like warm water for the most part. They grow better in warmer water, and there's just less food on the West Coast compared to the East Coast, and that's just primary productivity being in a colder environment.
With different species and climates comes different challenges for oyster farmers here on the West Coast. The main focus right now is the spread of a disease agent that causes Pacific oyster mortality syndrome.
That has decimated industries in Europe and Oceania down in Australia and New Zealand. This is a viral pathogen, and when it shows up, it can have catastrophic losses to the farm. It's got a really high juvenile mortality rate, and unfortunately, that pathogen has been detected in San Diego Bay in 2018 and then again in 2020.
Researchers believe this complex pathogen attacks the oyster's immune system, leaving it susceptible to bacterial diseases commonly found in the water. Like many shellfish pathogens, there are no pre-tell signs of this disease infecting oysters. All oyster farmers can do is document the mortality rates. The fact that Pacific oyster mortality syndrome has been detected in the San Diego Bay has rung the alarm for oyster farmers up and down the West Coast.
We've got a pretty extensive surveillance network set up to monitor where that pathogen is and isn't along the West Coast, and luckily it has not spread outside of San Diego Bay yet. But one of the biggest concerns I've heard from industry is breeding a more resilient oyster, a more disease-resistant oyster to that pathogen. The West Coast industry is very, very keen on being proactive about this and increasing that disease resistance so that if the pathogen does become more widespread, the losses that they would sustain aren't as catastrophic as what happened in Oceania and in Europe.
Researchers have been placing many different families of oysters in the field and measuring gene performance differences between those families. They then use genetic variation that's naturally present in the oysters and select the best performing ones. This is classical genetic selection, and believe it or not, still involves paper-based records of each family's genealogy.
What we're doing now, and USDA is really excited about, and I'm spearheading on the West Coast, is instead of just using those paper pedigree records, that family history on paper, technology is now advanced to a point where we can actually go in and genotype or sequence many, many genes throughout the genome of each individual animal and get an actual empirical estimate of how related each animal is to each other. We're really excited about the gains that genotyping and that sequencing can give us in terms of improving this disease resistance trait, for example. We'll be able to improve that trait much faster than we would if we were only using the pedigree paper-based selection method.
While Dr. Thompson continues his work on breeding new strains of oysters resistant to Pacific oyster mortality syndrome, he's also studying how climate change is creating new and mysterious issues for the Pacific Ocean.
I often hear from industry partners that there are mortality events that they simply can't explain. That's really challenging and frustrating because it could be a whole host of things. It could be harmful algae. It could be temperature effects. Like on the West Coast this summer, we had a really, really nasty heat wave coincide with a really, really low tide. And so that exposed shellfish for a long time out of water to these really hot air temperatures. In thinking about traits and phenotypes to improve in the breeding program, I'm certainly interested in trying to sort of quantify that environmental resilience to things like temperature, harmful algae concentrations, things along that line that basically stress the animal out where it's growing. Because oysters don't and shellfish don't have the opportunity to swim to a nicer stream or a nicer part of the ocean. Where they are is where they chose to be or where the farmer chose to put them. So that's really the challenge of being an oyster.
Dr. Thompson noted that the biggest environmental change that has impacted oyster aquaculture has been ocean acidification, or the rise in pH levels in the Pacific Ocean. These elevated pH levels have been especially tough on baby oysters.
There were a few years in the late 2000s where there were just mass hatchery mortalities and nobody really understood what was going on. And so that really led into the nascent research around ocean acidification and pH effects.
Trying to solve these mysteries can certainly be challenging and, yes, frustrating for a researcher, but it also gives Dr. Thompson the opportunity to partner with fellow researchers and oyster farmers to find real, tangible solutions to their biggest problems. And it's that type of collaboration that results in a sustainable supply of fresh, healthy oysters that's ready to be placed in your shopping cart. Thanks for listening to this fishy edition of Science in Your Shopping Cart. Stay tuned for future podcasts, and in case you missed it, check out our other podcasts on our website or on our YouTube channel. For Science in Your Shopping Cart, I'm Todd Silver.
Science in Your Shopping Cart is produced by the Office of Communications, Agricultural Research Service, an agency of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. For more information, visit www.ars.usda.gov. Follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Instagram, like us on Facebook, and watch us on YouTube.